Okay, now that I've switched computers and I'm on one that actually has NetBeans on it so I can do the coding, I do want to begin right here in this section 37.3.2 and creating a servlet so we get the process started. So I'm going to move these instructions over to my second screen and I might bounce back to them occasionally here as I need. But the first step is to create a new project inside of NetBeans. Now, the one thing I'm going to do before I do that, by the way, is I'm going to start collapsing down some of these things that I have open just to kind of get them out of the way. And then I'm going to come up here and create a new project. We're still going to stay with the Java web category and still stay with web application. So make those two choices and go ahead and click next. Now they're suggesting that we type this in as our name of our project, which happens to be the author's last name, by the way. And since I've done this so many times, I'm actually gonna like put that name in, but actually put the year after it, maybe even the semester, because that's how many I probably have on this machine. And they are suggesting that we store in the root of the C drive. And I think I explained earlier that they often do that in programming books so that everybody's on the same page. You should really be putting this where you store your stuff for this class for this semester. And so you can see with mine, I'm putting it on my Google Drive, which is my G Drive, Java 2, 2021 Spring folder. That seems perfect. All right, so if you have that, go ahead and click next. All right. Once again, we do have to choose our development server. We are not choosing Tomcat. We are choosing Glassfish. That's probably the only one you have installed. And then the latest version of Java Enterprise for Web, which on my machine is Enterprise version 7. So make sure that you choose that. Once you're all set with those steps, go ahead. If you can click next if you wish. Now I want you to notice we do not have to choose Java Server Faces now to do this work because we are not using that framework. We are using Servlets, which has, as we already indicated, is an extension of a superclass within Java. So we can just go ahead directly and click Finish. All right, now that we have this up and running and created, once again, you guys will notice that we do get the same kind of project folder structure built up, including separate folders for Java files and separate folders for our web pages. Do you guys notice that there's one major difference with the web output that we're creating here? That we are now, because we're not using Java Server Faces, we are using servlets, we do not need to use the XML declarations, which we were using in Server Faces, or the XHTML file format for our web pages. In fact, now we're using just straight up HTML5 for the web portion of this, and I think that's kind of neat. So you can tell that just by simply looking at the doc type. So now you guys are on familiar turf. There's no weird XML declarations or libraries or tag prefixes you have to memorize or anything like that. Just standard web output. Now the next step in the instructions says that we can create a servlet in the project as follows. And so they want you to go up right up here to the project node. That's what this is called, the root of your project in the package or project explorer. And they want you to go ahead and right click that and choose new, and then from the list choose servlet. Now if you're like me, you probably don't have it listed. Well, actually it is listed. Okay, so if it is listed, go ahead and click on it. If it is not, you will find yourself going to the other menu item at the bottom and then hunting through to find it or doing a search. But for me, it is listed, and I'm hoping it's listed for you guys too. So go ahead and choose New Servlet. Now that'll bring up a new set of dialog boxes that we're going to kind of step through once again, and to add some stuff. So the first thing that they would like us to do here is to create one called First Servlet. So let's just follow along for the sake of it and getting it working. We'll just type first and then servlet, just like that. Should indicate your project name. And then you may want to consider, you know, throwing in a package declaration at this point. Now, the author is recommending that you choose chapter 37, and I don't know functionally if this makes any difference at all, but hey, you know what, let's follow along and do what they say. We'll just call it chapter 37, no spaces, by the way, just all text and numbers. All right. All right, go ahead and click next. Now we get to the server deployment page, and there are a couple of little settings that we might want to look at here. The first thing that we want to do is there's a little checkbox here that says add information to deployment descriptor. And I want you to notice that the deployment descriptor is actually a special file inside of our project called web XML. And yes, it's an XML file, and it is an XML format that will hold information about the tools that we're using, the technologies, the server that we're using, and all of those little pieces. And sometimes those pieces of information are critical to getting an application to launch right, especially if other pieces of software are reading that information in order to run the software. And then in some cases, if you're moving from environment to environment, that's the file that you go to make adjustments so that you can make it run on a different platform if you're moving it around, by the way. Pretty common actions. Most of this stuff auto-populates here, and that's really the only choice that we need to make in this situation. And so when you've clicked that box, just go ahead and click Finish. And then you'll see that now in our source package folder, we do have a new Java file with a bunch of stuff added to it. So the first thing that you notice right off the bat, you know, and this is probably the first time I've actually told you to put in a package declaration, and I do that mostly to make sure that this works, to be real frank, because I get the idea is it gets a little buggy if you don't. And then a bunch of standard libraries are included to help the servlets run. So a couple of Java I/O libraries and several different servlet calls. You'll notice that it automatically did the class extension for us to the superclass of HTTP servlet. And then it also has in here, in this case, they're not calling it do get, they're calling process request. That basically does the same thing that we looked at in the example, which is to receive a request from the server and then send back a response in a container, which is usually a bunch of text that generates the web page. There are exception handlers here once again, and in this case, they are actually putting in a try statement to try some code. In other words, you're going to try to output this stuff to the web, and then assuming that it works, we're good. And if not, then normally you would have a catch statement in there. The one thing that I want you to notice that you might very easily miss is the fact that there's this auxiliary thing down here at the bottom with a plus mark next to it, and it says HTTP servlet methods. Click on the plus sign to the left to edit the code. And you can see I'm like hovering over it, and it kind of like brings all of it up. But if you're curious, you can click on this, and this is all the code that helps us to actually run the servlet that we usually leave collapsed and we don't mess with, because basically it comes with, it's predetermined, and this is the spot where that do get method actually gets put in. So we do a do get and a do post. And those of you that have now gone through at least a modicum of like basic web classes should understand at this point that there's differences with how we interact with web applications, and what it means to do a get and what it means to do a post. And you know, the simple example that I normally give to kind of demonstrate the difference between an application that uses get and an application that uses post is a Google search. So if I come to here and I search for, you know, like car in Google, and I look really carefully right here at the address bar, not only do I see google.com, but then there's this stuff that follows that is in plain text indicating what I actually searched for. And you see right here where I'm getting to, it says car, right? And it has all these other parameters and stuff. But the crux of it is really the search string here. And when you can see the output of a form in the URL, folks, that's called a get. That means the information that's being transmitted over the web is visible in plain text in the address call, including the search parameters that you're sending. If I was to run an application that was sending information via post, so if the Google search form worked with a post as opposed to a GET, the information in transit would be obscured from the address bar. So it wouldn't be readable as plain text in the address bar, but, and this is really important, unless the traffic is encrypted, is still interceptable over the web as plain text. And so a lot of times when we're doing forms, you almost always with forms see HTTPS. It depends on the kind of information you're gathering, but anything that's even remotely sensitive should go through HTTPS, and then even the post, anything that's plain text gets encrypted in transit, can't intercept it. All right, that's the get in the post. If you wanted a little refresher on it. And normally with that section, we just leave it collapsed because we don't really have to mess with it. It's really this stuff that's kind of our situation. Now, you'll notice that in this program, it just kind of created a basic file. Very easy to understand what it's doing. It's going to create a web page with a simple H1 in it. And it says servlet first servlet at, and then request get context path. And it puts whatever that does into an H1. And so one of the things that we would do at this point is maybe replace that particular text with something else. And that's what they do in the book. They basically take that content and put something else on the screen just so we can see, does it work? And so what I'm going to do right now is I'm actually going to get this removed from here. I'm going to remove this call. And the way that I'm going to do it is I'm just going to grab it, cut it, and then in place of this, I'm just going to say, hey, whatever, or whatever you want to say. And let's see if we can just get this to run for one thing. And this is an important first step just to make sure that the environment is working. So if you come to your application now, they give you a couple of tips on how to run these applications. And, the general thinking is, okay, wait, so this created a web page, right? So because we're doing a web application, but it seems like this Java file is also creating a web page, and are they the same thing? However, here's what's going to happen. We are going to choose here to run this, and then we are going to make sure that we manually navigate to the first servlet page as an application, as opposed to navigating to it as a file. All right. All right, so I'm going to come up here now to the project node, and in the project node, I'm going to choose to select run. And what this is going to do is it's going to, down here, launch Glassfish. So you can see Glassfish launching and going through its like startup and all that stuff. And then if we are successful, it will allow us to proceed. And apparently I have to put in my password here, and I hope I remember what it was. I think I'm doing this every time now, and I'm always thinking I'm forgetting it. And I seem to manage to guess it on the first try every time, which I did again. All right, so here is the application. So the first thing you're going to go is, oh, stop. This is not what I typed. This is wrong. Well, keep in mind that when we launched this, the page that it actually launched was the index file. And if you look at the index file and open it, well, it says exactly that, to do write content. So it did exactly what we told it to do. But now that we have the application running, what the book is asking us to do is append to our URL first servlet. In other words, the class file you just created, and that's press enter. And what's happened here is it is now looking within that project or application structure for something named first servlet, and it found it and it ran it. And if we, once again, whenever you run these technologies, always right click view source, look at what it's generating. And I did, to its point. I'm realizing something really horrible here. It just launched an Internet Explorer. And You know what, folks? This is a good reason just to stop the application right here. I'm not sure what it's doing in the background, but boy, it's totally hanging up.
I don't remember creating master passwords uh, for the IDE. Any thoughts?
Um, Sam, I know that like I use certain ones for myself, and apparently that's what I used. Um, there's a chance that maybe you use like one of your standard passwords, or maybe even left it blank.
Okay.
I don't know if anybody else is having that problem. Yeah, Internet
I
Explorer
need to
looks
go to the
pretty locked up here to me. I'm going to pause the recording and I'm going to launch a different browser. So bear with me here.
It's funny though.
We are going to try launching this again, but this time I'm going to make sure to switch over to Chrome or a browser that actually is a little more modern. Even Edge would have been better. So let's go ahead and relaunch this. It is going to go back to that default page, and then we are going to append here first servlet, and this should, there we go, load right up. And all I really wanted to do was this, right click view source. I don't know why it would take Internet Explorer forever to do that. But notice that the output is the text exactly as it was entered into the servlet Java code. And so in its most fundamental sense, we have now successfully, generated an application that does this work. All right, so if I can do that, okay, and this is where it gets a little bit interesting. If I can do that, can I write Java code to do whatever in the background and then feed the result of that into that HTML code to push out to the web page? And the answer, of course, is yes. And so the way that what you guys are going to discover is the way that servlets will differ from JSP, where with JSP we write our Java code inside the HTML. In servlets, we write the HTML within the Java. See the two distinctions there. And so we will be focusing, our attentions on this Java file or these Java files to put in the other stuff that we need to build the homework. So now, with this information, believe it or not, this is enough information actually to go ahead and get kind of busy doing the homework and being mindful of the time and how much we have to cover in one day. We are proceeding forward. But before we do, any questions or problems so far? All right, so exercise 37.1 is basically a repeat of exercise 39.1, which is to create a factorial table as shown before. So if you guys remember this, we're doing the exact same thing. Now, the beauty of that is we have the code, at least to do the factorial, already created, and the logic for displaying it already created. Now we're just going to do it in a different web output format, which makes it kind of fun because, we have basically that example to work from. So what I'm doing here is I'm looking at the one that I created during class. I forget if it was last week or whatever. But here is what we did using Java server faces, right? And this is a different technology, but what I can tell you is that this method here, as it sits verbatim, can be copied and brought over to the new application that we're going to create. And there's one of the keys right there is we're going to create a new application. Or if you wish, and I'm just kind of putting it out there because this is how I'm going to do mine, is instead of creating another, servlet, I already have one running here. This one, and granted, it's got a blank HTML file. I have this first servlet thing in here, but all I have to do is create another file inside of here called Factorials, right inside this source package folder. So I'm going to actually right click here, just create new, and then I'm going to go ahead and throw in a new servlet. So we choose servlet, remember, because that brings in all the tools that we need. So let's just go ahead and call this servlet. Hey, Factorial sounds good to me to do this. And do we want to put it in the chapter 37 package? Absolutely. Okay, so the class name is Factorial. The package name is chapter 37. I'm going to go ahead and click next. We do want to add information to the deployment descriptor, the XML file as we did before. And then we can go ahead and click finish. All right, now all it's done is created another file down here, And our job now is to paste in the method that we copied from the other application and then find a way to output it to the screen using this new technology. And so let's kind of step through that procedure. The first step really is to get that other method in here. Now, if you're looking at my screen, I have a whole bunch of stuff that's open here. And I'm trying to close some of these down just to make a little bit more space on the screen and the ability to see some of the other tabs. All right, so I did find this old Compute Factorial tab here, so I'm going to highlight that whole method, copy it, and then I'm going to come over to our new Java program here and just find a spot anywhere here to paste it in, as long as it's before that closing curly bracket. I'm actually going to paste it in right here just so I can see it if I need to, and just do a paste. All right, you should paste in cleanly. There's no errors in the code. The logic for doing the math is exactly the same. The other difficulties really lie in how do we inject this then into the HTML. And what I think is kind of helpful in that regard is to look at that approach that we did before and notice that we ended up kind of creating a table structure and then also running a loop and then putting the numbers into cells within that loop, as we build each cell in the table, and then closing the table and then sending that all back to the browser. And this approach is really not going to be any different. All right, so we did drop the method for computing the factorial into my code share here, and you can see the URL and the code for that. And we are just copying that right into our NetBeans program. I guess I really did need to put it in code share. I think it's mostly for the sake of all you all who don't have quick and ready access to it. But what I am hoping is that you can find your code from exercise 39.1, where we kind of did the same work. And even though this was done in a different program, and in that program where we're using Java server faces, we were building up a string of HTML to feed back into the HTML page. We are basically going to follow this exact algorithm to code system out statements for our servlets assignment and build the application. So the logic is exactly the same. There's some advantages to this. Of course, we can work a lot faster because we don't have to recreate it from scratch, but also because the logic's worked out and the logic works, so there's no reason to change the logic. But let's go ahead and at this point we have some differences, and the one difference is this. What they're demonstrating with the servlets here, first of all, they are writing the entire HTML document from beginning. So they're writing the doc type and everything on down. Now, a question students will often ask me is this. In this approach here, we assigned everything to a string and concatenated everything in, and then ultimately just returned the string. Could we do something like that here? Yes, you totally could follow that type of technique as well. I'm not going to do it that way because we already kind of have, the basic structure here of the HTML document. It's silly to feed it into a string and do all that, at least with the stuff that's already on the page, right? However, the other stuff, the stuff that we want to add to the body section, hey, could we even just copy that string creation code right from the other program? And the answer is yes. And so that is exactly what I'm going to do. So the table part of what we're going to create, we're just going to do exactly what we did before, because it does contain HTML code. And then I can just output at the end of all this just S. So I would do output print line S, and it will do all of this code, including the loop, calling the method to do the factorial correctly. It's all there. So I'm just going to do a simple highlight of all this code and a copy. Then I'll come back over here to my Factorial Java assignment, and I will be replacing the stuff here. And I want to show you this real kind of carefully and incrementally here, because the way I'm going to do it is like this. First, I'm going to paste in that code. So this is the code that creates the string variable that creates the beginning of the table. and then a loop, which is going to go through and populate the factorials. And I'm indenting just so it looks better to me, if you guys are wondering. And then here, instead of outputting an H1, we are just simply going to output S, which is the string that contains all of it. And then we'll go ahead, close our body, close our HTML, and our document is done. And believe it or not, folks, that's the whole program. It almost seems too easy, right? Well, it is, because we've already figured out the logic for doing the factorial. We don't have to talk through that. We have that down. We have the logic for getting it on the screen and running the factorial correctly to generate the table. So we don't need to recreate that. And then all we have to do is inject that into the HTML content. And we're doing that. So this is enough to make it work. And let's go ahead and test it. Now, this is kind of weird. We already have this application running in the background. And when we ran it, and you can see Glassfish is still running, in the background, we did not have the factorial part of it compiled. So if I try to call upon it now, it will fail, by the way. So what we need to do is we need to actually stop Glassfish from running. So come down here to the Glassfish tab, hit the stop button to stop the server running. And then we'll come back up here to the project node, right click and run. We do want the application to rebuild, so it does compile the factorial code, and then we can run it. Now it will come up to that like silly little web page, the default one, which is the to do or whatever it said. So we'll just let that do its work here. And I'm not sure if it actually did it in the background or not. I don't think so, not quite yet. And so now I'm just going back to the application here. I'm just going to do a refresh. I'm not seeing it like launching the browser, and it seems like it's running. And I can test, what I've already tested before. So I can do first servlet. It seems to be working. And now I'm going to go ahead and type in here factorial, just the way I named my class, and press enter. And there is my factorial table, folks. If you want to right click and see your output, do that. I always recommend that. You can see it's just as ugly here as it was before, because that's how we formatted it. We put it all on one line of code. Remember, browser doesn't care, it'll still execute it. And yes, you can put in formatting commands if you really want it on separate lines, but it did work, and it did create the right output, which is our goal. So folks, this is the completion of exercise 37.1 and factorials. And just to kind of very quickly review how we did that, we created a servlets web application, added a servlet, which is basically just a Java file that allows us to do print lines directly to the browser. We used some of the basic code, copied our other code from the other application, including the method that does the factorials, injected it, output everything as just a single variable, got it to the browser, and it worked. All right, now that we successfully have completed our chapter 37 exercise and got an overview of servlets, we're now going to take a look at another Java web technology called Java Server Pages, or JSP for short. And Java Server Pages is actually the original of the Java web technologies, and arguably probably the most popular and still very heavily used by coders all over the place. And the reason that it is such a popular tool is because it works so much like other tools that are similar. And I gave the example of PHP before because, believe it or not, JSP kind of modeled itself after PHP in its ability to intermingle Java code with HTML. Now, what we just saw with NetBeans and servlets, when we were creating this factorial or this first servlet assignment, is the fact that we were adding HTML to a Java file to output to the web, right? Basically writing the HTML file right inside the Java code. Now we're going to flip it and we're going to write the Java code inside the HTML to show you that approach as well. And we are going to do the same exact exercise ultimately. But let's talk a little bit about the technology and how it works and an overview. So we go to chapter 38. I do ask that you guys do take the time to kind of read through and do this, read this chapter carefully. Lots of employment exists just using this technology, for example, as you go out there. The interesting thing about JSP, and I just want you to look at kind of the difference here.
Are we supposed to be seeing your screen?
Yeah, you know what? You guys always get me on that, don't you? Thank you. No bonus points for pointing out how the teacher's wrong, though, by the way. But here's a little example. So we are in, if you're wondering, chapter 38. We're just right on the first page of the chapter. And right off the bat, they go directly into an example of JSP and how it works. And might trigger in many of you like, oh my God, why didn't we learn this first? I know that's the reaction I usually get. And the reason I don't teach this first is because this is considered the antiquated technology and the one that's falling out of favor, by the way. And really, like I said, Oracle Corporation really prefers that you either use servlets or more preferably Java server faces because of the strictness of the formats and the frameworks and its capabilities on the back end. But JSP, you can see we're writing regular HTML here, folks. The difference is we are putting in these special delimiter tags, just like you do in PHP, to separate Java code from your HTML code and take that Java code and embed it directly into your document. And so I'm just writing my HTML, and then all of a sudden I get that special delimiter tag. And by the way, these are called ASP style delimiters because these are the same ones you use with ASP.NET, by the way. And then you inject in between those tags a standard line of Java code. And what this line of Java code does here is it gets the system time from the computer that it's running on, and then we'll bring that back as text, and then will be inserted into this web page. So this web page will basically come up on screen, and it'll say current time is, and there's the time. And meanwhile, you have just written Java code that's intermingled. There's not a separate Java file here. The Java code is right inside the HTML file, but the HTML file that we will be creating will have a JSP file extension to it. And so this is a special message to the web server. Hey, whenever you see this file extension, not only is it a web page, but it also needs this backend Java component running, either Tomcat or Glassfish, to drive the Java code and marry it with my HTML to get the web output. Very, very popular with web designers. Why? Because as some of you who are coming right out of the PHP class directly into this one will realize, hey, well, with PHP, we do like bracket, question mark, PHP code, and then put HTML in front and behind it, and we have a web page. Same kind of approach here with JSP. So you don't have to even change much from your PHP style skills of coding to employ this. But once again, this is the most antiquated of all the approaches. Now, they do walk us through the process here of, once again, doing a little bit of a sample application. So we're going to do exactly the same thing again, is we're going to do the simple little example, and then we'll jump into the exercise, and you'll get a feel for how this stuff works. Now, interestingly, because of the way that we built the application that we already have, the one that we built in for Servlets, we can use that same project to drive JSP as well as we can drive Servlets, which is kind of bizarre, right? So you can kind of intermingle JSP and Servlets very, very easily because they don't require that separate framework that Java server faces include. So if you remember that last box that we checked to include the Java server faces components. So we don't even have to build a new project here. We can just do all the work directly inside the same file. Now, what you might want to do is you might want to create a separate package file, however you want to do that, that's up to you. I'm just going to work right inside the same structure, and that's quite all right that you do that, by the way. Please feel free. So down here in this area, I'm going to pull my instructions over to the other screen now and just kind of read from there. We are going to follow the steps that they have here on this page, and it says basically this. Right-click the project node and choose New, and this time we're going to choose JSP. And here, once again, it may or may not be listed. Oh, there it is on mine, towards the bottom. So go ahead and click JSP. Once again, you get that very similar interface here. Let's see if they want us to call this current time. So let's type current time, and that should be enough there. And then notice, I want you to notice that you have options for which approach that you use. I want you to stick with standard syntax, by the way. We don't need to change that. No other choices to make here at all. And all you have to do is basically click finish. All right. Now, the interesting thing is when we're building an application like this, did you guys notice that there wasn't a step that said, hey, what server are you using, right? Because JSP files, by their very nature, it's assumed that you're using a server, right? Because it is HTML. You know, you're not writing just a straight Java file here. Now, why that distinction? Because very often in professional development, you'll have projects that are broken down into like web pages and code files and whatever, and you will have often distinct people working on each aspect of it. So like the person creating the HTML might not do any of the Java, and the person doing the Java might not do any of the HTML, and that's perfectly normal. But if you are writing JSP, you are usually intermingling, so it's just assumed it's going to a browser. All right. Now, the thing that they want us to do is actually go ahead and complete the code that showed that they showed in the chapter. So probably a good idea is maybe to change the title here, which they did in the code in the example. So we'll change that to current time. And then down here in the body section, and I'll tell you what, folks, you want to leave in front of or inside of an H1 tag. That's what I'm going to do. You should do that. And I'm just going to type what they put, which is current time is, and then we're going to use our ASP style delimiters. And I want you to notice as I type that you know the basic approach is a bracket with a % sign following, and a % sign and a bracket to close. But sometimes they include additional characters after it, and in this case, we're including an equal sign, and that equal sign does have special meaning, which means, I think generally it means that we're injecting something in here, is what that means. We'll look it up in just a second. But the thing that we're supposed to call upon is the Java util libraries, and we're pulling back the date method, and then we're going to end our statement. So we close with a % bracket. And so this little piece here, and yes, I typed data, that should say date. Date, there we go. So that's Java code intermingled here. And we are putting one very simple little statement, nothing complicated, you know, no extended like, you know, methods or anything like that, just a very simple little statement just to prove that it works. And folks, this is really about all there is to it. Make sure you save your work before you try it. And then over here on the project side, I want you to notice where the JSP file is saved. Notice how it did not save into the source package folder, right? Because it's not considered a Java file at this point, it's considered a web file. And so what they want us to do is just very simply right-click and run the file. Now, very curiously, because of the way this technology works, let's get it up in the browser and you'll see what I mean. And of course, it's not triggering my browser right now, so I'm going to manually go to my browser where I know I have that application is open. And see how it opened up. And it did put the current time in there just to prove that it's working. Let's hit refresh and the time updated. And then notice the URL and the file call, right? Also notice the fact that I didn't go to the trouble of stopping Glassfish to make this run, because this is handled in a slightly different way. They have basically runtime components that handle the live Java calls and run the code dynamically, just like we would with sort of like JavaScript or PHP or something like that. And we are calling the file directly in order to get it to run, just like we would a regular web page. Let's hit that refresh button again so you can see that the time will update every time I hit that refresh button to the correct system time. So hopefully if you guys have this working, then we're ready for the exercise. So let's take a real quick pause here and see where we're at. All right, now we're going to code through the exercise. So why don't we begin by getting that exercise kind of read into the record here if you want to look at it that way. So I'm going to pull my PDF back over here for a second. And I'm going to go to the end of the chapter here where the exercise is listed. There are some really cool little in-chapter exercises on some of these if you guys want to, if you have the time someday to go through them. And basically, we're just doing the factorial table again. I guess we don't have to reread the instructions for that since we know what we're doing at this point. The first obvious question you should probably ask yourself is, can we use the same method again to do the computations? The answer, of course, is yes. And can we use the same output logic to generate the table? And once again, the answer is yes, which is a wonderful thing and saves us a bunch of time. But we're still learning about the new technology. But let's look at the different approach that we have here now when we're working with some of this stuff. So the first thing is I want to explain a little bit about these delimiters and what they mean and how they're operating. And I'm going to see if I can kind of zoom in on my code here a little bit. It's going to let me. And that's one of those things with NetBeans I don't like. It doesn't have a control scroll forward or a control plus to zoom in. You have to go to the menus to do it. But when we are looking at these delimiters, so when we are creating JSP code, there's three formats for these indicators. The one format is just the bracket and the percent sign. And in that situation, the code inside those ASP style delimiters is just straight Java code that has no intent of being seen by the user looking at the web page. It's just Java code that's operating in the background. So if you're just writing Java code that operates in the background, it's just the percent sign. If you are writing Java code where you are including a method that is operating in the application but is not, once again, being included in the output, it's not going to the browser, this would switch to an exclamation point. If you are writing code that goes back to the browser, then you add the equal sign, which is why we added it here. It's basically a way of saying that, hey, this is going to be seen. We're sending this out there. So this is going to the browser, that equal sign. And as we write this little exercise, we're going to do all three. All right. So let's go ahead and begin by, well, this one's called current time. You know what? Let's start by creating a new JSP. So let's do that first. Let's come up here to the project node and say new, and JSP now should be right up near the top. And let's call this one, come up with something that's unique. Let's call it compute. Oops, I got a lot of junk in there. Compute Factorial. All right, standard syntax on that. Where is it going? It's going in the web page folder, which is fine. And then we're going to go ahead and just click finish. All right, up here in the title area, well, JSP page, you know what, that's probably fine. If you want, you could say JSP Factorial. If you want to be a little more precise about it. We are going to replace all the content in the body section, including that little hello world there. Let's go ahead and make a little space here. First things first. Will we use that same method to compute the factorial? Answer is yes. We have the code, so we don't have to reinvent the wheel. So let's just come down here and copy this entire method and come back now to our JSP page and paste it in. I'm going to kind of backspace this. Now, the first thing you guys are going to notice is like, hey, Ty, it's not color coding. There's something wrong. And you are right. There is something wrong because I'm doing this in an HTML file, basically. And I need to put those ASP style delimiters around this code so that the Java engine knows to ignore it, or the HTML engine knows to ignore it. So what we'll do is we'll go bracket %, and because this is going to be hidden, this is not going to the browser, we're going to use exclamation point to open it. And then after the closing curly bracket, we are going to go % bracket to terminate the statement. Now you can see how they match. Okay, so that method is in there. We need that in there in order to be able to do the computations. And you notice how easy it was on top of it all. And this is what I always liked about JSP is, if you know your HTML and you know your Java, it's really easy to just drop the stuff in, intermingle, and go. So that has that like beautiful simplicity. All right, so that first piece is in place. The next piece that we need is all the stuff that generates the table and runs the loop to do all that stuff. Now, once again, the question becomes, hey, could we copy this code? Once again, and the answer, once again, of course, is yes, absolutely, and why not? We are not going to copy the return statement. We're going to copy everything but the return statement here. So this is the same code that we used before in both of the applications. So we're just going to right-click copy here and bring it over to the new application. Now, you should anticipate, because this is Java code intermingled with the HTML, that yes, we will need those opening and closing brackets here. And I'm going to put the openings and the closings in directly. Now, important consideration also is the fact that the code that we're going to drop in here, which is just basically generating the table, running the loop, and calling the function, that is not something the users need to see. It's not going to the browser. It's all back-end logic. And we're just going to paste that right in here. So the delimiters that we're using for this section of code will just be the straight bracket and %sign, right? And that straight Java code can just come right in here, no problem, right? All of that HTML is being stored in a variable called S. We have our method that we're using to do the math here. And then ultimately, we'd like to get this stuff on the screen, right? So I'm going to do that here at the bottom. And so here at the bottom, I'm just going to do this. I'm going to create some simple HTML. Well, let's do it in H2. That's what I did last time. Display these silly little numbers again. ... Or whatever you want to say. Maybe display factorial would be better. Up to you. But just so you can see that, yes, I can just type some regular HTML here. And then, of course, to get the stuff on the screen, everything was stored into a variable called S. And all we have to do is output S. And watch how painfully simple this is. We're going to do a % delimiter here. We are going to screen, so we'll put in the equal sign. And then just drop in S. That's all the text that is inside of S will just drop onto the screen now, and then we close it. You don't have to say return, you don't have to say print line, you just put S in there. That's all the code that we just created dropped into one single character variable. All right, and folks, the work is done. This is all of it. So I'm going to go ahead and hit Control S here again. I'm going to get rid of a couple of these like blank lines in here just to kind of pull things together a little bit tighter so you guys can maybe see it all on the screen at the same time. How novel would that be, right? Pretty close. And I suppose I could like bring these lines up and make it a little truncated, but here's all the code. All right, now comes time to run this. Make sure you are saved. We don't need to rebuild Glassfish or anything like that. It should just run. I'm going to come over here in the project panel and right click and choose run. Now, I like it when the browser comes forward, but I know that it's in the background running this. So we're going to go back here now, and I want you to notice that this is what I just created. And notice once again, the URL is the same name as the JSP file that we created. And it seems to have worked correctly. Of course, you should right-click View Source to see what it output, but this is what we created. And there it is.